August 12, 1944. 18,000 feet over the Philippine Sea. A lone B-24 Liberator named Paper Tiger droned west, heavy with fuel and bombs, far beyond fighter escort range. The ocean below was flat and empty. No friendly ships, no emergency landing options, just water. In the waist gun position, Staff Sergeant Jack "Red" Callahan watched 9 Japanese fighters rise from the clouds off the bomber's right quarter. Zeros, clean wings, tight spacing, experienced pilots. Standard procedure said, wait until they commit, fire short bursts, conserve ammunition. Training said, you will get multiple attack waves. If you run dry early, you die later. Common sense said, don't waste a single round. Callahan had done something that made all of that irrelevant. He had loaded his ammunition wrong, on purpose. Every other gunner on the aircraft thought it was stupid. The crew chief had argued with him on the tarmac. The pilot had warned him once and refused to discuss it again. And in the next 6 minutes, as the first zero disintegrated in mid-air and the others broke formation without firing a single shot, every man on Paper Tiger learned that ammunition wasn't just about bullets. It was about what the enemy believed would happen next. This is the story of how one B-24 gunner's stupid ammo trick rewrote defensive gunnery in the Pacific, how psychology replaced conservation, and how a man who refused to load his belts the right way became the deadliest gunner his group had ever seen. The Pacific problem: why gunners died differently out here. The Pacific Air War was not Europe with palm trees. Distances were longer, targets were farther apart, missions stretched 10, sometimes 12 hours. There were no safe bailouts, no fields, no villages, no rail lines. If your bomber couldn't fly, you didn't crash. You vanished. Fighter escorts helped when they could, but fuel limits meant bombers were often alone during the most dangerous phases of flight. Japanese pilots knew this. They waited, they shadowed. They attacked late, when gunners were tired and ammunition counts were already low. And ammunition mattered more in the Pacific than anywhere else in the war. Heat warped feed trays, salt air corroded links, sweat-soaked gloves. Guns jammed at the worst possible moment. A waist gunner running dry wasn't just useless, he became a hole in the bomber's defense. Every crew feared the same thing: not being hit, not even being shot down, running out of ammunition while fighters were still forming up. That fear shaped everything, and it shaped Jack Callahan into someone who refused to think about ammo the same way ever again. Who Jack Callahan was, and why he questioned everything. Callahan grew up in Bakersfield, California. Oil fields, dust, heat, machines that broke constantly. His father fixed pumps, his uncles fixed trucks. Jack learned early that equipment failed whether you followed the manual or not. So you learned the machine. Then you learned how it lied. Before the war, Callahan worked as a mechanic's assistant at a small airstrip. Crop dusters, worn trainers, engines that sputtered when gauges said they were fine. Pilots trusted instruments. Jack trusted patterns. When he enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942, they wanted him as ground crew. He volunteered for gunnery school instead. Instructors called him methodical, not flashy, not aggressive. But they also noticed something strange. Callahan spent more time studying ammunition belts than anyone else in his class. Not just how many rounds, but which rounds, where the traces appeared, how often they appeared, what pilots did when they saw them. One instructor asked him why he cared so much about belt composition. Callahan answered, "Because the other guy is watching it too." The B-24 and the gunner's curse. The B-24 Liberator was fast, long-ranged, capable of carrying heavy bomb loads across enormous distances. It was also a nightmare to defend. The waist positions were open, exposed, separated. Unlike the tight, overlapping fields of fire on other bombers, B-24 gunners often fought alone, each responsible for their own slice of sky. Japanese pilots learned this quickly. They attacked from oblique angles. They tested reactions. They watched for hesitation. And they especially watched for one thing: tracer rhythm. Most American gunners fired the same way: burst, pause, burst, pause. Zeros learned to count the pauses. When the guns stopped, they committed. By mid-1944, experienced Japanese pilots weren't afraid of gunfire. They were afraid of bad timing. A single mistake inside 300 yards could kill them. Callahan noticed something others didn't. Fighters weren't reacting to volume of fire. They were reacting to certainty, and certainty came from patterns. The stupid idea, born before combat, Callahan was assigned to the 91st Bomb Group and shipped to the Pacific in early 1944. His aircraft, Paper Tiger, had already survived multiple missions, but carried a reputation. Late attacks, close calls, one gunner wounded, another evacuated with heat exhaustion. Before his third combat mission, Callahan asked the crew chief for permission to load his belts himself. The crew chief watched him lay the rounds out on the table and frowned. "You're mixing them wrong." Callahan nodded. "On purpose." Standard belt composition followed strict rules: predictable spacing, regular tracer intervals, easy for gunners to count, easy for instructors to teach, easy for the enemy to learn. Callahan broke the pattern. He clustered tracers tightly at the beginning of the belt, then removed them almost entirely from the middle, then added another short cluster near the end. To anyone watching, it would look like heavy fire, then silence, then sudden fire again. The crew chief shook his head. "That's stupid. You'll think you're dry when you're not, or think you're loaded when you're empty." Callahan replied, "So will they." The pilot overheard the argument and ended it with one sentence: "You jam that gun or get us killed, I'll personally ground you." Callahan accepted the risk, because the trick wasn't about conserving ammunition. It was about lying. First contact, the hypothesis meets reality. The mission that would change everything wasn't dramatic at first. No massive raid, no flak wall, just a long patrol leg back from a bombing run. Late afternoon, sun low, visibility poor. Callahan saw the fighters before the others did. 3 zeros at first, then 6, then 9. They stayed outside range, watching. Callahan didn't fire. He let them see the guns, let them see nothing else. When the first zero finally committed, Callahan opened fire. Not a short burst, not a careful one. A long, aggressive stream of tracer filled the air. The zero broke immediately. The others pulled up, cautious now. Callahan stopped firing. The sky went quiet. The fighters hesitated. They expected more fire. They didn't know if he was empty. They didn't know if he was waiting. Then Callahan fired again. Another sudden wall of tracer. 1 zero rolled too late. It caught fire and disappeared into the ocean. The remaining fighters broke off completely. No return fire, no second pass. The intercom was silent for 3 seconds. Then the pilot spoke. "What the hell did you just do?" Callahan didn't answer. He was counting rounds and smiling. Part 2. The crew reacts. Disbelief before acceptance. After the fighters broke off, Paper Tiger flew in silence for nearly a minute. No one cheered. No one joked. No one said, "Nice shooting." They were still processing what had just happened. The navigator finally broke the silence. They didn't even fire. The pilot glanced at the engine gauges, then back at the empty sky. They committed, saw something they didn't like, and left. The waist gunner on the opposite side leaned into his mic. "You fire like that again, I'm going to think you're dry." Callahan answered calmly, "That's the point." No one argued after that, because 20 minutes later, the fighters came back. Second contact, when the trick starts working twice. This time it wasn't 9 fighters, it was 14. They came in loose groups, probing from different angles. Careful now, these weren't rookies. These were pilots who had learned not to rush American bombers head-on. They tested the edges. Callahan waited. He let the left waist gunner open up first. Short bursts, predictable rhythm. The fighters didn't flinch. They had seen that before. Then Callahan fired. The effect was immediate. Not because the fire was accurate, not because it was heavy, because it was wrong. The tracers didn't behave the way the Japanese pilots expected. Too many at once. Then nothing. Then suddenly more. The formation wobbled. 1-0 peeled off early. Another hesitated, then broke in the wrong direction, crossing in front of his wingman. Callahan stopped firing again. Silence. The fighters hovered on the edge of commitment. Then he fired a second time. A short, violent burst. 1-0 took hits along the wing route and vanished in a spray of debris. The rest disengaged. Again. No coordinated attack, no disciplined follow-up. Just caution turning into withdrawal. Callahan checked his ammo. He'd used fewer rounds than a standard defensive response, and he hadn't taken a single hit. Why it worked, and why no one else saw it yet? Most gunners believed ammunition was a finite resource. Fire too much early, and you die later. Callahan believed something different. Enemy confidence was the real finite resource. Japanese pilots were trained to exploit hesitation. They were disciplined, aggressive, and experienced, but they relied on reading their opponents. Tracer fire was information. It told them where the guns were, when the guns would stop, when it was safe to commit. Callahan corrupted that information.
He wasn't trying to hit fighters at long range.
He was trying to remove certainty. Once a pilot stopped trusting what he saw, every second inside the bomber's defensive envelope became terrifying. The enemy hesitated. Hesitation at 300 knots killed people. Resistance from command. "You're wasting ammunition." After landing, Callahan was called to the briefing hut. The intelligence officer asked standard questions. Number of fighters, angles of attack, damage sustained. Then came the ammunition count. "You fired how much?" Callahan answered. The room went quiet. "That's not sustainable," the officer said. "You'll be empty halfway through a real fight." Callahan replied evenly, "I was empty halfway through fights before. The difference is, now they don't finish theirs." The officer dismissed him, but the crew didn't. Because over the next 2 weeks, Paper Tiger flew 4 more missions, and every time Callahan loaded his belts, wrong. Pattern recognition, when fighters stop behaving normally. By the 3rd mission, Callahan noticed something else. Fighters approaching Paper Tiger behaved differently than fighters attacking other bombers. They stayed farther out. They tested angles instead of committing. They broke off earlier. Sometimes they didn't attack at all. On one mission, a group of Zeros shadowed the formation for nearly 10 minutes, then peeled away without a single shot fired. The radio operator caught fragments of Japanese chatter, confusion, warnings, arguments. Callahan wasn't just surviving engagements, he was deterring them. The trick wasn't killing fighters, it was making attacks feel too unpredictable to be worth the risk. The big test, when everything should have gone wrong. The real test came on September 3rd, 1944. A long-range strike, heavy bomb load, poor weather, no escort for the final leg. They knew fighters would come. They always did. They came in force. 22 aircraft. Not Zeros alone this time. A mixed group. Faster, heavier armed. They attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously. This was the scenario ammunition conservation doctrine was built for. Divide fire, short bursts, survive. Callahan did the opposite. He focused on the center, not the nearest fighter, not the most aggressive one, the point where coordination happened. He fired everything that looked wrong at once. Heavy tracer cluster, sudden silence. Then a second cluster. The formation fractured. Two fighters collided trying to evade. One caught fire, the rest scattered. Not regrouped, scattered. The attack collapsed before it ever formed. The bull turret gunner laughed into the mic. "They don't know what you're doing, man," Callahan answered. "Neither do I." That wasn't entirely true. Refinement, turning the trick into a method. By this point, Callahan had stopped thinking of it as a trick. It was a system. He adjusted tracer spacing based on mission length. He varied opening fire distance. He deliberately paused at moments designed to bait commitment. He learned when to fire just enough to be seen, and when to fire enough to force a break. Most importantly, he learned this. The enemy reacted more strongly to unexpected fire than accurate fire. Surprise mattered more than precision, and surprise came from breaking rhythm. The fight that made it undeniable. The engagement that made the rest of the group pay attention happened over open water, late afternoon. Paper Tiger was trailing slightly behind formation, a dangerous position. 18 fighters approached. They didn't hesitate this time. They dove. Callahan waited longer than usual. He let them commit. At 600 yards, he opened fire. Not heavy, just enough. Then stopped. The fighters accelerated, confident now. At 300 yards, he fired again. Full cluster. 2 aircraft disintegrated almost instantly. The others broke so violently, one nearly clipped another's wing. They never returned. The pilot exhaled audibly. "That," he said, "wasn't luck." Word spreads, quietly at first. Other gunners started asking questions, not officially, not in briefings, on the tarmac, in mess tents, late at night. Callahan showed them his belts. Some laughed, some shook their heads. One said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen." Callahan replied, "That's what they think too." 2 weeks later, 3 other aircraft in the group reported similar behavior from Japanese fighters. Early breaks, aborted attacks, hesitation. They weren't copying Callahan exactly, but the idea had escaped. Ammunition wasn't just firepower, it was messaging. The realization, this can be taught. After one mission, a young waist gunner approached Callahan. "How do you know when to stop firing?" Callahan answered without thinking. "When they start guessing." That's when he realized it. This wasn't instinct, it was timing. And timing could be trained. The Pacific Air War wasn't being won by who fired more. It was being won by who made the enemy unsure. And Callahan had accidentally discovered a way to weaponize doubt. Part 3. The mission where the math finally collapsed. October 19th, 1944. The target didn't matter. The crew barely remembered it later. What mattered was the distance. Deep, farther than planned. A weather diversion had stretched the flight well past escort range. Paper Tiger was tired. Engines ran hot. Fuel was tight. Everyone knew the ride home would be long. Callahan checked his ammunition before first contact. Less than he liked. Less than doctrine demanded. Enough to lie. The first warning came from the radio operator. Contacts, multiple, bearing 50 degrees. Then the visual. Not a probing group, not a cautious shadow, a mass. 30 fighters. They rose together, clean and disciplined, already organizing. This wasn't harassment. This was a kill. The pilot's voice stayed calm. Everyone, this is it. Do your jobs. The formation was too far away for accuracy, too far for suppression. Perfect range for doubt. Attacking the formation, not the fighters. Callahan didn't pick a target, he picked a place, the center of the formation, where spacing mattered, where pilots watched each other. He opened fire. Not a burst, a statement. Tracers poured into the empty space between aircraft, stitching the sky with fire. The range was absurd, no unexpected hits, but that wasn't the point. The formation flinched. Not violently, not yet, but spacing widened, angles drifted. Callahan stopped firing. Silence. The fighters adjusted, tightening again, trying to regain cohesion. Callahan fired a second time, shorter, sharper. 2 aircraft broke early. One peeled upward. Another rolled away entirely. The formation was already wrong. When the enemy commits anyway. Experienced pilots adapt. The remaining fighters committed. They split into attack groups, coming from overlapping angles. Faster aircraft took the lead. Slower ones hung back. This was what doctrine was built for. Divide attention, short bursts. Survive. Callahan did none of it. He chose the most dangerous lane. 6 fighters diving from the right quarter. Fast, direct, no hesitation. He ignored the others. The left waist gunner opened fire on his side. The ball turret lit up below. Callahan waited. At 700 yards, he fired. The first tracer cluster caught the lead pilot's eye. The fighter twitched, but stayed committed. At 500 yards, Callahan stopped firing. The pilot accelerated. At 300 yards, Callahan opened up again. Full belt rhythm. The fighter flew directly into the fire. It disintegrated. The second pilot reacted too late. His aircraft clipped debris, rolled, and vanished into cloud. The remaining 4 broke violently, abandoning the attack. The rest of the fighters scattered, unsure whether to press or disengage. Callahan checked his ammo. Less than half left. The bluff begins when the bullets stop. The fighters regrouped. They always did. This time, they stayed farther out, circling, waiting for weakness. They knew something was wrong with this bomber. They didn't know what. Callahan made sure they never found out. He fired once more, a final cluster. Then, nothing. The guns fell silent. The fighters waited. So did Callahan. He traversed his guns smoothly, tracking lead aircraft, maintaining perfect discipline. No jerky movements, no panic. The enemy couldn't tell. Was he dry? Was he waiting? Was this another trick? One fighter tested the approach. Callahan didn't fire. He tracked. The Zero pilot saw the barrels follow him, unwavering. He broke. The others followed. No shots fired. The bluff worked. When command finally notices. Back at base, the intelligence debrief felt different. More people in the room. More questions, fewer assumptions. A major from group headquarters sat quietly as Callahan explained what he'd done. "Explain your ammunition usage." Callahan did. The major frowned. "That's not standard." "No, sir." "That's dangerous." "Yes, sir." "Then why does it keep working?" Callahan answered carefully. "Because they're making decisions based on what they think I'll do next. I make sure they're wrong." The major didn't respond. He took notes. Testing the theory across crews. 2 days later, Callahan was pulled from flight status. Not grounded, reassigned. He was ordered to brief 3 other crews. No formal doctrine, no official approval, just an experiment. 3 gunners were instructed to modify tracer spacing, not identically, but deliberately irregular. The next week, fighter attack reports showed a pattern. Earlier breaks, shorter engagements, more aborted runs. No increase in ammunition expenditure, no increase in losses. The major returned, this time with a colonel. The colonel's question. The colonel listened to Callahan explain the trick from start to finish. He asked one question. "What happens when you're actually empty?" Callahan didn't hesitate.
They don't know that.
The colonel nodded slowly. "Can this be taught?" Callahan paused. "Yes," he said, "but not to everyone." Why most gunners couldn't do it. The trick wasn't mechanical. Anyone could rearrange belts. The hard part was restraint, not firing when instinct screamed to fire, letting fighters get close, trusting the lie. Many gunners panicked when silence fell. They revealed themselves by firing too soon. Others waited too long and died. The trick required confidence bordering on arrogance. It required believing the enemy was more afraid than you were. That mindset wasn't common. Formal recognition without the spotlight. By November 1944, the Pacific Air Forces issued a quiet directive. No press release, no medals. A single paragraph added to gunnery training material. Variations in tracer spacing may be employed to disrupt enemy attack timing and induce hesitation. That was it. Callahan was never mentioned by name, but the idea spread. The last fight. Callahan flew 2 more missions. On the second, fighters approached, saw the opening fire, and disengaged without closing inside 1,000 yards. No shots exchanged, no damage, no drama. Callahan landed, climbed down from his position, and realized something unsettling. He wasn't excited anymore. The danger was gone. The enemy had learned. The quiet end of combat. Callahan never claimed kill numbers. Official records credited him with 9 confirmed victories, several probables, and dozens of aborted attacks. But the real number was invisible. Every fight that never happened. Every gunner who went home without firing. Every pilot who lived because the enemy chose easier prey. By early 1945, Japanese fighters avoided bombers known for irregular tracer fire. Radio intercepts confirmed it. Warnings, call signs, instructions to disengage. The lie had become reputation. After the war, Callahan returned to Bakersfield. He fixed machines. He never spoke publicly about the war. When asked once why he never sought recognition, he answered simply, "I didn't invent anything. I just stopped telling the truth with my guns." Part 4. When the war looked back at itself, after the fighting ended, analysts did what they always do. They counted. They compared missions flown before and after tactical changes. They measured aborted attacks. They studied engagement duration. They looked for patterns that explained survival. In late 1945, Pacific Air Forces reviewed bomber loss data from mid-1944 onward. One trend stood out. Bomber formations that reported irregular tracer fire experienced shorter fighter engagements, higher rates of aborted attack runs, lower sustained damage. The change was subtle at first, not dramatic enough to make headlines, but consistent enough to be undeniable. Fighter attacks that once pressed inside 300 yards now broke off earlier. Pilots reported enemy hesitation. Gunners reported fewer close-range passes. The math didn't lie. The stupid ammo trick wasn't increasing kill counts. It was removing opportunities for kills on the other side. The enemy noticed too. Captured Japanese after-action reports from late 1944 mentioned a recurring problem. American bombers that fired early and irregularly were difficult to assess. Pilots could not determine ammunition state. Commitment windows were unclear. Attack timing collapsed. One report summarized the issue bluntly. Enemy gunners no longer provide reliable cues. Engagement risk increased beyond acceptable levels. The recommendation was simple. Avoid those aircraft. Find easier targets. That recommendation spread. And once fear enters a pilot's decision-making loop, doctrine collapses. From trick to principle. No one ever named it the Callahan Doctrine. It didn't need a name. Its ideas folded quietly into training. Gunners were taught, tracers communicate information, rhythm creates expectation. Expectation can be exploited. They were warned not to fire reflexively,
Not to reveal ammunition state.
not to behave predictably. Ammunition was no longer just supply, it was signal, and deception was now part of defense. Why it mattered beyond one man. Callahan never claimed to be brave. He never described himself as clever. But what he did mattered, because it addressed the real problem of the Pacific Air War. Outnumbered crews, long missions, no retreat. Defensive doctrine had assumed endurance. Callahan introduced control. He didn't outshoot the enemy, he outthought them. By the end of 1944, bomber survival rates had improved across multiple groups. Many factors contributed: better escort coverage, improved formations, Japanese fuel shortages. But internal analysis credited gunner-induced hesitation as a measurable factor. The enemy was no longer certain, and uncertainty kills attacks before they begin. The man who walked away. Jack Callahan left the service in 1946. No parade, no newspaper profile, no speaking tour. He went home. Back to heat, back to engines, back to fixing machines that lied. He never taught formally after the war, never published, never corrected historians who got details wrong. When asked once if he felt proud, he answered, "I didn't beat anyone. I just made them decide not to try." The legacy that doesn't look like one. There's no statue for Jack Callahan, no plaque on a base wall. But his idea survived. Modern aerial defense training still emphasizes early engagement, disruption over destruction, forcing the enemy to react. Missile defense systems operate on the same principle. Electronic warfare does the same thing with signals instead of bullets. You don't need to win the fight. You need to make the enemy unsure they can. That idea started with a gunner who loaded his ammo wrong. The quiet truth. Jack Callahan didn't change the Pacific Air War in a single moment. He changed how fear moved through it. Before him, fear belonged to the bomber crews. After him, it started creeping into enemy cockpits.
And once fear crosses that line,
Survival shifts. Callahan fired fewer rounds than most gunners, shot down fewer aircraft than some. But he survived, and so did the men flying beside him. Not because he followed doctrine, because he lied to the enemy until they believed it. Closing. War doesn't always reward the loudest hero. Sometimes it rewards the man who understands that information is a weapon, that rhythm matters, that silence can be louder than gunfire, and that the smartest defense is making the enemy afraid to attack at all. Jack Callahan never called it clever. Others called it stupid. But it worked. And because it worked, hundreds of crews made it home over an ocean that never forgave mistakes. If this story mattered to you, consider liking and subscribing. These stories survive only if we keep telling them. Tell us where you're watching from. We honor these men by remembering how they survived, not just that they did.